Should we get started on time, or should we wait a little bit? Or
I'll leave it up to you. You're in charge.
I'm in charge. Uh-oh. I guess we might as well get started on time, and then, you know, people will come and go as they please. So my clock says it's 11 o'clock. So good evening to the Americas, and good morning to Europe, and good afternoon to Asia. So welcome to, I guess, the first session of today for some definition of today, which is the Ask Me Anything session with Paul Kocher. So he's been an extremely influential figure in the chess and crypto communities, among other things, pioneering timing and power analysis attacks against cryptography. He founded cryptography research, was a designer of SSL3, has been deeply involved in hardware security for a long time. So there's tons and tons of things to talk about. I'll be watching the Zulip chat for questions as they come in. So post your questions there. And I guess we can get started. Let's see. We have a couple questions already. So we'll start with the general question that Kevin McCurley posted to Zulip, which is what subfields of cryptography do you think have the most opportunity for young people to explore right now, and which are just too hard to make progress on? What advice do you have on problem selection for things to work on?
Ooh, that's a hard question. That's a really hard question. At least for me, the things I'm interested in tend to be the things that don't fit really neatly into the box of cryptography. And I think of cryptography as kind of like bricks and mortar for an architect. And so if you're going to go build a system, you certainly care immensely about the properties of the components you're using, but they're not usually the final objective. So I would encourage folks to take an expansive view of the problem and ask questions like, how can we use cryptography to address a question like enabling insecure systems to cope with connectivity, rather than, for example, working with a standard assumption that everything needs to be completely secure. If you start with a problem like that, it may lead you in some direction that's really unpredictable. It may also lead you into directions that aren't just cryptography. But within crypto itself, I mean, some of the areas are really well trodden, like trying to break AES. It's certainly a very bold choice of directions to go in just because so many people have pounded their heads against it. So trying to look for something where other people aren't asking the question. But that's hard, because if you go to a conference, you're going to see all the papers about the questions everybody is asking rather than the ones that aren't. Another way to maybe look for a question that's interesting is to ask, what is everybody assuming? Like if everybody is assuming that the software is completely bug-free, or that speculative execution is a perfectly safe thing to do in your processor, or whatever it is, going and asking yourself about these assumptions might well lead to interesting results. And there are all these mental shortcuts and engineering shortcuts that all of us use in order to be able to function in our daily lives, but they're usually wrong in some way. And the people who can figure out where those errors are often end up with really interesting observations. So that's my way of answering the question while completely dodging it.
Okay, I will tack on a question that I want to hear the answer to, which is related to this. So what was the genesis of your original papers on timing and power analysis? Because it seems to fit along with the theme of what you just described. So like, where did this come from?
So the timing attack work started where I was trying to implement differential cryptanalysis. So I read BM and Shamir's papers, and they seemed really neat, but the correlations were too small for me to be able to do anything useful with. My computer was too slow. I didn't have enough disk space and so forth. So that was really frustrating. And I basically then started looking around and saying, okay, well, if I can't get correlations that are any good from this, are there any other correlations I can get? And I had done optimized crypto implementations and knew that they were varying in time from running benchmarks. So I knew that there was stuff there, and that came to mind as one of the things to look at. And that's sort of like when somebody, I don't know, if you're walking through the forest and you find some rock and you look under the rock and then there's like all kinds of worms and stuff there. It was pretty clear that there were a whole lot of worms that hadn't been explored. And I actually went and reread the timing attack paper. I even talked about power analysis and other possible directions there. So it was pretty clear that there were all of these sort of unexplored problems. I remember at Crypto, after I presented that paper, somebody actually said, well, this probably doesn't really belong at this conference. It's engineering, not cryptography. And it was meant in a positive way. It was somebody, it wasn't like a negative comment, but I still feel a little proud about that, having a paper that doesn't fit neatly into the conference. And now there are conferences that paper fits neatly into, and trying to think of what other places where there are papers that aren't neatly fitting is something that I've been trying to do. On power analysis, that one, it actually took a few years before I actually went and got an oscilloscope. I remember driving to Fry's Electronics and bought the cheapest oscilloscope they had. It was an analog oscilloscope, which for people who are younger than about 30, you've hopefully never seen one of these things, but they have a phosphor and a cathode ray gun that shoots electrons at the phosphor, and immediately everything goes dark. So you have to do everything in a dark room. So I could only do it at night. And Josh Jaffe and I started seeing power traces that were showing all kinds of neat stuff out of smart cards really quickly. So that one was like one of these sort of immediate aha moments, because it was, I think the first thing we looked at was an RSA, and it had the classic, squaring multiply pattern that you could see. But the theory on that wasn't particularly complicated. It was then just a question of going and doing the electronics and hooking up the system to the computers and so forth.
That's been definitely influential to the field. So I have a question from Boyan Yang. So there's been sort of a steady trickle of leakage resilience papers at CHES and also at other fields or at other conferences. What do you think the impact of leakage resilience on the CHES field and cryptography and practical deployment will be in, say, 2025 or 2030?
It's a hard question to answer what the engineering direction that will be used in the real system. So you say impact, there's kind of the question of what is the direction that academic papers go, and there's also a different question of where industry goes. And right now, there's a small set of people in industry who know that side channel attacks exist and they matter and they're engineering against them. I think that on the leakage resilience side, if we started getting those techniques integrated into big protocols, then it would start having impact that would multiply. But absent guidance in protocols and so forth for it, I'm not sure how widely used it will be outside of, again, the smart cards and TPMs and government systems and things where people know there's the problem here. Broadly, the state of security implementations is really, really poor. And maybe kind of going back to the previous question of areas to explore, there's a bit of there's the gap between kind of technologies and outcomes. And as a field, we've been really good at coming up with lots of individual technologies. But if you sort of think of if cryptography were surgery, our patients are basically all dying, and we're not really asking why. We haven't had a theory of sanitation come along or come up with guidance that can tell a, above average engineering manager who's working on a tight schedule, who needs to ship a connected device, that needs to do some crypto, how to actually succeed with a reasonable probability. And this, there's lots of individual suggestions. Most of them are in conflict with each other, like test forever and have update mechanisms and make sure everything's in hardware and hire all the world's best cryptographers to spend years analyzing your system. But there isn't like a roadmap or a checklist or a usable set of tools at this point. So, and this goes far beyond just leakage resistance. It covers the whole field, from protocol design to software engineering to hardware engineering to just even knowing what architecture should look like. So, but while I'm sounding depressing here, especially for this audience, this is actually super good, because it means that the hard problems are not impossible to solve, but nobody's quite figured out the right way to frame the problem and work on them yet. So I think if you were to look forward, I forget what year Boyan said in his question, but 10 years from now, I think we'll have a whole enormously much more nuanced sense of what cryptography in practice ought to look like. Whereas right now, again, we have sort of individual data points scattered around, but we don't have any kind of good unifying theory crossing those ideas.
So I guess this is a good transition to Kevin McCurley's next question. You mentioned protocols a couple of times. So Kevin asks, how did you get involved working on SSL in the early days?
So Tahir El-Gamal was the chief scientist at Netscape, and he had a version 2 of the protocol that had been put together by actually a really brilliant non-crypto guy, somebody who'd read the textbook and put a protocol together, which for somebody who did that he did really well. So I'm not actually being critical of it, but that wasn't going to hold up. And there was kind of the daily SSL is broken story was running. And so Tahir, I don't remember if he called me directly or asked Marty Hellman who he could call. And just like the next day I was down at Netscape trying to figure out what was wrong with the current protocol, building a new one. There were 3 of us working on it. Phil Carlton, who was a non-crypto person, but understood the whole standards process and was doing a lot of that. Alan Fryer, who was handling the documentation, and me were figuring out the protocol. And over a period of just a few weeks, we put this together. And I don't know if you want to view it as a success or a tragic failure. I think probably could go down as both. Certainly did a lot of things better than protocols before it, but there have also been a lot of things about that protocol that maybe weren't perfect as well, and I'll be the first to admit them. I don't know if you want me to admit them here or not, but
that sounds like an invitation to ask you about the things that weren't quite right in the protocol.
I mean, the biggest mistake is the one that lots of us make, and I'll be the first to admit that I make it, which is that when you're working on a system, or when I'm working on a system, I have this confidence that I've addressed all the things I understand. And I infer from that therefore I've solved the problem correctly. And obviously, when you step back and you look at that, the thing that the mistake that I was making there and have made it at other times is to assume that I know everything, which is completely and tragically wrong. So the gaps in my knowledge, things like error attacks and some of the problems with some of the ciphers and the ways that people were going to use the thing where adaptive chosen ciphertext was not only like conceivable, but super easy. So there were all of these sort of areas of either ignorance or murkiness that I wasn't paying attention to. And some of the things that I didn't know didn't end up being problems because there was some sort of nuts and bolts approaches to it. And the built-in upgrade mechanism was like really the one thing that I think I got right in the concept of the protocol, which was just to assume that everything was going to have to be replaced in pieces at various times and plan for that. So that was probably the biggest error there. And I've made mistakes in lots and lots of other areas too, which I can keep talking about if you want, but I don't know if you have another question you want to go into.
We've got a couple more questions coming in from the chat room. So Mehdi Tibuchi asks, not going along with the flow in terms of what research topic to choose is really good, but you then face the problem of convincing everyone, and especially reviewers at crypto conferences, that the problem you're tackling is actually interesting. You've been very successful at that, but it seems challenging in general. How should we approach that issue?
I don't think I have the answer to that because in some ways I've kept one foot in the academic world, but for me, the objective of the things that I work on isn't a paper. And if something leads to a paper, that's actually kind of frustrating because it's a lot of work writing papers, and I have done it. I don't know, timing attacks, DPA, Spectre, SSL. It's a handful of things that I've published, but they've been things where I felt like there was some either necessity or that was part of the path to having an impact. I think if you have a really great idea that the reviewers can't get their heads around, that's actually the best research result, and figuring out what to do with it or how to get the word out is kind of it's an annoying thing to have to worry about, at least if you're not an academic. If you are one and you're worried about citations and tenure, that's a whole different set of optimization problems, which I was going to say I've been thankfully avoided, but I've dealt with different set of problems over my career running companies and building systems, which are also just a different set of hard constraints. And so I think for me, the reason for publishing a paper is actually not that the paper will even appear, it's that it will hopefully enable other people to keep thinking in the direction of whatever the paper starts. So I think actually the most fun thing for me is getting to read like the papers people have written about Spectre after that paper that I wrote, reading about all the different side channel directions people are taking it, and the things that I never would have anticipated. And that's what publishing enables. So if you have an idea that doesn't fit neatly, it may lead to a major area of focus at a conference. Chess didn't exist when I did the DPA paper, but in some ways, things like power analysis show that there are a lot of interesting problems for academics to do in the area of implementation. So I don't know, I would view that as like a big win if I could come up with an idea that wouldn't fit neatly in a conference. So I don't. So yeah, I'm avoiding the question, but.
So do you have any advice for people who might want to sort of straddle academic impact and non-academic impact the way that you have? I mean, you have sort of a very non-traditional background, but like you've managed to be fully engaged in the academic community while saying you hate writing papers. So if there are other people who want to follow in this kind of path, what do you think they should do?
Well, I'm going to start with something. So when I was an undergraduate in college, I had, oh my God, what am I going to be when I grow up? And I asked probably 20 people that I thought were like amazingly successful. And every single one of them said to do what they did, except for the doctors and lawyers who said, don't go into law and medicine. So when you say I have a non-traditional background, I mean, I was going to be a veterinarian. I majored in biology. I don't have any postgraduate degrees. So I'm basically I was going to be a vet. That was my plan in life. But I'm somebody who can kind of pass as vaguely competent in many different areas. So following the advice that everybody gave me, I would encourage people to try to at least have a familiarity with lots of things that are not directly related specifically just to some narrow crypto problem. So if I look at the things that have helped me across the years I've been working, it includes cryptography, but other things like sales and marketing and finance, electronics, project management, chip design, I don't know, patents, law. And I'm not like particularly good at any of these things, but having at least some understanding about why people do the things they do in those areas has proven super useful. In terms of career directions, I mean, there's kind of the three big choices. One is academia, one is working for big tech companies, and then the third is a startup. And since I kind of went the entrepreneurial route, I mean, I think I would say you're crazy if you do it, and you're crazy if you don't do it.
Excuse me, I'd like to interrupt. You forgot government.
Well, okay, you can put that under big tech, kind of, they're pretty similar. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but big organizations. But anyway, about the entrepreneurial direction though, it's the way that you can have really, really big impact and work on real problems and choose the directions that you're going in. But you can't hand wave over anything. I mean, there's nobody else to fix the roof if it's leaking or to deal with, an employee complexity or whatever it might be. And the set of constraints that you run into ends up being really diverse and not just technology. Like the fraction of really great crypto papers that are viable as a business is really, really small. So there's some really hard challenges there, and there's not like a roadmap you can follow that tells you what to do. So if you like that sort of sense of opportunity and lack of constraints, I totally encourage people to consider that, especially when you're young. I started cryptography research as I finished my senior year of college, and started out doing consulting work and was basically cheaper than other people who are doing consulting work and willing to tackle interesting problems. And I've got lots of scars and had lots of fun times from running cryptography research. I also co-founded a company, Valicert, that went public in the first .com bubble. So if anybody here is thinking about going that direction, I'm totally happy to spend some time either talking about the mistakes I've made or, I'm an advisor and investor in a lot of companies, so have, again, lots of scars from that kind of direction. But certainly would consider people to look that direction, especially when you're young and you don't have lots of expensive things that you need to pay in terms of, rent and childcare and so forth. So you can go and take some risks.
So we have another question from Torben Moos. What do you believe is more rewarding, working on the offensive side or the defensive side of security?
I think defense is a lot more interesting. And it's a much, much, much harder set of problems because it forces a breadth-based perspective rather than a sort of narrow specialization. Now, from working on defense, you will discover failures and things going wrong, and but problems like how do you go build a chip where your revenue from that chip is contingent on solving a tamper resistance problem. Like I've done that sort of project, and those are super, super fun. It's also the areas where you'll have the most positive impact. I mean, coming up with a new attack is good in the sense that it forces designers to adjust if they do. But if you can come up with a protocol or an architecture or a system that will do something useful for end users or meaningfully change the world, that's a much bigger impact than you can probably have with an offense paper. It doesn't mean that the offense work isn't totally critical, because we need to understand how things fail in order to be able to build better systems. But again, I think I view offensive work as really a step in the path toward doing better defense. But that's just my view. There are other people who view it differently, and certainly there's some criminals who view it differently and intelligence agencies who view it differently. Like if you look at intelligence agencies, they have, offense and then they have defense, and it's just different set of budgetary constraints and so forth, I guess.
So we have another question from Billion Yang. Is that an actual motherboard on your desk?
Yes, that's a server motherboard that Intel sent me a while ago, and I use it occasionally, though it's really noisy. And my cheap oscilloscope.
So we have a question from Benedict Geerlix. Speaking of making errors, what's the biggest mistake you ever made?
I think I'm going to sort of dodge the problem a little bit, but I think the mistake I keep making is one of not understanding other perspectives well enough. And the people that I've been around me that had the most diverse perspectives have provided the most complementary benefits, but they're often the hardest to work with, especially at first. The three of us that were kind of running cryptography research was myself, Kit Rogers, who played football for Stanford, and he also studied engineering, but I did not play football. I know this is going to shock some of you. And Ben Jun, and Ben's kind of perspective in life is one of being very comprehensive about understanding everything and ensuring nothing fails. And I'm kind of off thinking about random directions, and Kit's super social, and Ben's trying to make sure nothing fails. And the three of us work together really well. I think if you had removed any of those three viewpoints, things would have gone badly. Another area that I've made various mistakes is underestimating the sort of power of politics and inertia. So I'm somebody where I'll sort of think an idea and then assume that that idea transmits well, but especially if you have a team of people, or you, even worse, have a organization that's reached the scale of where internal battles are logical to fight as opposed to purely fighting the common external battle, things get really challenging in ways that aren't particularly intuitive to me. So I've cobbled my way through some of those problems, but certainly wish I'd had a better perspective before running into them.
So I think we have maybe time for one last question. I'm going to reword a question from Kevin McCurley slightly. So what areas of cryptography and security do you think deserve more attention or underexplored?
Well, let me start with the big one. We have no idea how our computers should work. For a fast computer, we know what that looks like. If you go and you take your current PC, it's running at sort of 99% of its theoretical speed given the power constraints that it has. But the question of what would one look like if you wanted to minimize the probability of failure while still being able to browse your email, do banking, et cetera, we really have no idea. We don't know what the memory model should look like. We don't know what the operating system should look like. We have some theories. There's different sort of individual pieces people have been putting together, but we really don't have a sense of that. And even the role of cryptography in it. I don't think that either SGX or a TPM is really the end all be all of what this should look like. So one area that I would love for this community to start trying to be is not reactive to the products that industry cobbles together, but asking the question of what's the potential here and how do we realize that? And that might lead you to a great paper, it might lead you to a company, it might lead you to influencing some company's roadmap, whatever it is. That's an area where it's the big thing we need to be doing, and we're often not doing that. Another example of an area that I think is important to think about is redundancy. We know how to do that in other areas like power supplies and jet engines and building structures, but we really haven't got a good sense of how to do that in computing systems. And it's the approach that everybody uses in every other industry if they want to make something that's going to be reliable or safe. You have, redundant pilots, redundant pilot meals. You have everything is redundant if you want something to work reliably. And we don't use that. We have some neat pieces like multi-party computation that seem like they're like incredibly powerful components, but there isn't like a unified vision of how to put all of this together. And I would love to have somebody publish like a really great paper that tells us how to take some of these components and actually get systems that can survive failure in ways that they can today. I don't know if that's a couple interesting directions, but not answers.
Well, my clock says that it is 11:26 p.m. on the West Coast. So that means that we are at time for the session. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I think that this might be it, but I'm sure there can be more interaction in the Zulip chat if people want to continue engaging. And yeah, thank you very much for that super thought-provoking session.
Thank you, everybody. And I've really been enjoying the conference. I will probably go over to one of the chat rooms that Kevin set up if anybody wants to continue the conversation there. And I will also log into Zulip and take questions there. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.